We're now going to study these remarkable film sequences in detail. This footage is some of the most important film taken in the Edwardian period. It shows the Titanic at Belfast during the final stages of its fitting out at the Harland and Wolff Yard in the spring of 1912. These shots represent the only moving images ever taken of the liner. Within a few weeks, the ship would be complete, ready for its journey to Southampton and the fateful maiden voyage. Whilst in the fitting-out berth, Titanic had some alterations to her promenade deck. This followed experience with the first ship, Olympic, which had ended service the previous summer. These are the actual ice floes the Titanic tried to negotiate on the night of April the 14th, 1912. Stretching some 60 miles long and 12 miles wide, many other vessels in the vicinity that night were stopped in their tracks by these perilous conditions. For some reason, the Titanic ploughed on at over 20 knots, until one of these huge bergs appeared at the ship's bow. Some eyewitness reports put these icebergs at between 50 and 200 feet high. It only needed one of them to rip through the hull of the White Star liner. "Come quickly, distress," was the emergency message sent from the Titanic by wireless operator Phillips after the collision. This coded radio signal was the forerunner of the SOS, better known today. In fact, Save Our Souls was transmitted by the Titanic that night in a desperate attempt at locating a rescue ship. These desperate calls for help would haunt Captain Smith all the way to his watery grave. Captain Smith is seen just 10 months earlier on the occasion of the maiden voyage of the Olympic, which he also commanded. He was just 61 years of age and had a distinguished career. He's seen dressed in his summer whites. As White Star's most senior captain, he was reputedly the highest paid on the North Atlantic run. News began to spread around the world about the liner's sinking, and naturally many people crowded around the White Star Line offices in New York, London and Southampton, anxiously awaiting reports. These scenes are of the offices in Lower Broadway, New York. And whilst an employee attends to the cleanliness of the building, relatives desperately wait for news of loved ones. Many Americans were on board the ship that night. Many would not return to their beloved country alive. The saviour in all this tragedy was the little Cunard liner Carpathia, which was on its way from Halifax to the Mediterranean at the time. Itself trapped in the ice floes off Newfoundland, the 13,000-ton ship risked all to get to the scene of the disaster. Altogether, the Carpathia rescued 705 passengers and crew from the Titanic's lifeboats as dawn broke on April the 15th. It took 4.5 hours to get everyone on board for the 3-day journey to New York. Ironically, the Cunard Line and the White Star Line merged a few years later. The Carpathia was sadly lost during the Second World War on active service. As the rescue ship steamed to New York, members of the press assembled to catch every storyline they could get. A certain amount of checkbook journalism, without doubt, took place. The Mary Scully was commandeered to meet the Carpathia off Long Island. The world was waiting for the real story, as up to now it was not clear how many had survived. Once the Carpathia had docked, the real scale of the disaster unfolded. Over 1,500 had gone down with the Titanic, including its captain and designer. The rescue ship attracted a good deal of attention that day. As well as the 705 extra passengers, it had over 700 passengers who had to contend with a journey back to America. Note the telegram boy, desperate to get his face known to the camera. He'd bought a telegram for one of the survivors. The crew of the Carpathia would have thrilling stories to tell for many years to come. These are the berths at the Cunard docks, where just the night before, 30,000 had gathered to get a glimpse of the survivors disembarking from Carpathia. Just along from here at Pier 59, a space had been booked for noon on Saturday the 20th of April for the maiden departure from New York of the Titanic. Many of the survivors left from these quaysides for their return to Europe, with their plans to live in the new world at an end. As New York mourned, its citizens brought spare clothing to the docks, indeed anything to comfort those men, women and children who'd lost everything. These scenes portray an Edwardian New York, with the women wearing the dress of the period. At the time these films were taken, cinematography was just 15 years old. The Titanic saga was the first incident of its kind to receive attention from the new moving image cameras. There were many heroes in this disaster, but none more than Captain Rostron and his crew of the Carpathia. He was knighted soon afterwards and died in 1940 at his hometown of Southampton. Father Hogue is reported as being one of the first people to spot the Titanic's lifeboats as the Carpathia neared the scene. He quite probably held services on board the rescue ship for those who perished. These are sequences of the actual crew rescued from the sea. Their faces tell the story they had lived through just 72 hours before. Many of the crew would testify at the inquiries held in New York and London to determine the cause of the tragedy. The inquiry in New York began the day after the survivors arrived in the city. This is Quartermaster Robert Hitchens, who was actually at the wheel of the Titanic as it hit the iceberg. He was to turn his wheel quickly to starboard by order of the first officer. These are more than likely the crew of the Carpathia, illustrating to reporters how Titanic's crew and passengers adorned the important life preserver belt. Here is Italian-born Marconi after giving evidence to the Senate investigation. It was his wireless radio invention that helped to save so many lives that calm, cold night on the North Atlantic. He and his wife very nearly sailed on the maiden voyage themselves. Oddly enough, the Titanic sailed past his home along the banks of Southampton Water. The grim task of collecting bodies from the sea was given to the cable ship Mackay Bennett. She left Halifax on April the 17th for the 4-day passage to the scene. The makeshift coffins are stored on the deck. Captain Lardner and his crew picked up 306 bodies, a third of which were buried at sea. Nothing remained of the ship Titanic. It would be 72 years before she was seen again. More film has recently come to light of the Harland and Wolff shipyard at Belfast. Here we see Titanic's elder sister, the Olympic, under construction. These fascinating scenes show exactly how they built the world's biggest liners. These important sequences were filmed from the laying of the keel in December 1908 until the launching in 1910. Olympic would receive the close attention of the owners and the press, being the very first of the new Leviathans. The Olympic was the brainchild of Bruce Ismay, chairman of the White Star Line, and Lord Pirrie, chairman of the builders Harland and Wolff. Their scheme was to produce a two-ship service across the Atlantic, giving their passengers the sheer opulence of the Edwardian period. The ships were the first in the world to pass the 40,000-ton mark. They would be the first to offer a la carte restaurant facilities and items such as elevators between decks. In all, the two new ships would cost £3 million. So big were they that the yard at Belfast had to firstly build new slipways before their construction could begin. The huge gantry dominated the skyline of the city. At over 850 feet in length, new quays had to be built in Southampton to accommodate the liners. In New York, the authorities were a little slow in preparing themselves for this new breed of passenger ship. These important scenes show the Titanic's sister gradually rising towards the sky, with the huge hull plates being lifted in for the riveters to begin their deafening work. In less than 4 months, a second keel would be laid down, that of a ship destined for disaster. This rare archive film has survived remarkably intact, its rusty tin helping to preserve the nitrate material. By the autumn of 1910, work on the liner's hull was complete, and she was launched into the water amidst great celebration. Work would now proceed to finish the liner off, ready for her maiden voyage in the summer of 1911. Titanic would get none of this attention at its launch a few months later. If the cameraman had panned just slightly to the left, he would have glimpsed the Titanic in the throes of construction. With the foresight of cameramen from the early part of the 20th century, we've been able to get a glimpse through a window on the past at the legend of Titanic. One thing is for certain, this legend will continue well into the 21st century.